Summergrove Park, in the late afternoon, wore the peaceful look of a city slowly waking from its midday nap. Pale sunlight filtered through the branches of towering old trees, casting shimmering patches of light and shadow across the stone-paved path. On an old wooden bench, Elijah Coleman, a black man in his early 40s, dressed neatly in a dark shirt and simple khaki pants, sat deeply engrossed in a thick leather-bound book. It was a collection of essays on justice and ethics, a volume he had cherished since college. To most people, this might have seemed like an ordinary scene, but to Officer Robert Kessler, who was patrolling not far away, it stirred something uneasy. A black man, sitting alone, too calm, not showing any signs of being there for recreation. His professional instincts, or more accurately, the psychological scar from an incident in his past, began to stir restlessly in his mind. He gripped his baton slightly tighter and murmured under his breath, "That's strange. Never seen this guy around here before." In Kessler's eyes, Elijah's stillness wasn't a sign of someone enjoying life. It was the mark of someone trying to hide. Meanwhile, Elijah had no idea he'd come under suspicion. He kept turning the pages of his book, occasionally glancing up to watch children playing in the distance. Each breath, every passing moment in this park, was his way of healing from the exhaustion of months of intense work. He had chosen Summergrove Park because he believed it was a place where people could be themselves, regardless of the color of their skin. But Elijah was no stranger to feeling watched. He had known all of that cold sensation on his neck, the glance that said everything without a single word, and the slow-moving shadows behind him. Today was no different, and once again, he could feel it. Something was approaching. Officer Robert Kessler strolled along the brick path, his eyes fixed on the man, sitting and reading. He didn't turn on his patrol lights, didn't radio for backup. He let his instincts, honed by years on the streets, guide him. Elijah sensed the steady footsteps approaching. He didn't need to look to know what was about to happen. It wasn't the first time, and each time he had to choose between maintaining his calm or preserving his dignity. He gently closed the book, marking his place with the corner of a tissue. When he looked up, his eyes met Kessler's. Two men, two opposing worlds, one peaceful, one primed for confrontation. "Good afternoon," Kessler said, his voice firm, but not loud. "What are you doing here?" Elijah kept a composed expression and replied softly, "I'm just reading." "This is a public park, isn't it?" There was nothing wrong with the answer, but to Kessler, it felt like a challenge. He sensed resistance, even though nothing had happened, and that made him feel even more uneasy, more in need of control. "I need to see some ID," Kessler said, his eyes now locked on the book in Elijah's hands. Elijah exhaled lightly, that statement and the tone behind it. It wasn't a simple request. It was suspicion, a verdict rendered without trial. "I'm sorry, officer," Elijah replied, his voice still calm, but with a firmer undertone. "I have the right to sit here without presenting ID unless I'm suspected of committing a specific crime. Not loud, not disrespectful, but enough to ignite Kessler's anger. Are you refusing to comply with a law enforcement officer?" Kessler stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster. "I have the authority to detain you, if I see fit." That moment, just a few seconds, carried the weight of decades of history, of thousands of encounters shaped by bias. And this time, Elijah Coleman stood on the fragile line between freedom and being detained, simply for being himself. At that moment, everything seemed frozen between the two men. Elijah Coleman remained seated, his eyes fixed on Officer Robert Kessler, eyes that held no hatred, no fear, only a deep weariness, born of experiences Kessler would never understand. "Do you know," Elijah said slowly, Every time I'm asked to show ID for no reason, I have to choose between peace and dignity?" Kessler didn't respond. Inside his head was a familiar buzzing, the sound of ingrained reflexes, of long-standing prejudice. He wasn't listening. He was reacting. "Stand up. Turn around. You're being detained for investigation," Kessler ordered, his hand drawing the cuffs. Elijah sighed softly, not out of fear, but out of disappointment. He knew that arguing now would only make things worse. He rose slowly, struggling to keep the anger from flashing in his eyes. As his hands were cuffed behind him, the chill of the metal wasn't as painful as the truth it carried. That he, a man who had served his country in silence, was being treated like a threat simply because of his skin color and calm demeanor. Kessler pushed him forward, unaware that he was handcuffing an FBI agent, one who had cracked cases far beyond Kessler's imagination. But Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to shout. He wanted Kessler's actions to expose the injustice, through the consequences they would bring upon themselves. And in that moment, as footsteps echoed across the quiet pavement, a lesson was quietly taking shape. Sometimes, how people respond to what they don't understand clearly reveals what needs to change. On the way to the police station, neither man said a word. Officer Kessler gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed on the rain-slicked road as if trying to wash away the confusion clouding his mind. But he couldn't deny it. Something about this man made him uneasy. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was too calm. Elijah Coleman sat in the back seat, his hands still cuffed, eyes gazing through the rain-speckled window. He remembered a similar morning years ago, also rainy, also cold, when he received news that he had been accepted into the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had believed that justice was a suit of armor, but reality had taught him that sometimes a person's first impression of you could be more potent than the badge you wore on your chest. "What do you do for a living?" Kessler asked suddenly, unable to hide the stiffness in his tone. "You'll find out soon enough," Elijah replied, voice calm, but razor sharp. Kessler frowned. He didn't like that answer. It wasn't the submissive silence he was used to. The car turned into the station's parking lot, neon lights casting a pale glow across both of their faces. Kessler got out first and opened the back door like a machine on autopilot. "Out of the car," he ordered. Elijah stepped down, wrists aching from the cuffs that had been fastened too tightly. But the deeper pain came from being suspected, not for anything he'd done, but for the color of his skin. A few heads turned inside the station as Kessler led Elijah through the main hallway. A man in a black shirt offering no resistance, making no noise, yet the look in his eyes seemed to weigh down the entire room. And then, as if fate were opening a door, the officer on duty saw the ID badge hanging from Elijah's waist. His eyes widened in shock. "Wait, what is this?" he stammered. "You arrested Agent Elijah Coleman? FBI?" The air in the room seemed to freeze. Like an iceberg, the truth had just slammed into the center of the room. Kessler stood frozen. Every word he might have used to justify himself now sounded hollow. He had just handcuffed a federal agent with no evidence, no charge, based only on a vague feeling, one he now knew deep down was prejudice. And at that very moment, the first lesson struck like lightning. Justice doesn't begin with slogans. It starts with how we treat those who are not like us. The silence in the police station's waiting area stretched on unnaturally. Desk Sergeant Morales held Elijah's ID card with slightly trembling hands. On the badge was a frontal photo with the full name Elijah R. Coleman, Senior Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation Division of Economic Crimes and Civil Rights. Sergeant Morales took a deep breath and quickly made his way to Captain Monroe's office, the precinct's commanding officer. Just minutes later, the conference room door flew open. "Bring Kessler in, now," the captain's voice cracked like thunder. And Agent Coleman comes with me. No one else is to interfere. Asterisk asterisk, the conference room was no longer a place for routine briefings. It had become an unofficial courtroom, where the scales of justice began to tip back in the right direction. Kessler walked in, still visibly shaken. Captain Monroe, a middle-aged woman with brown skin and eyes sharp as blades, looked directly at him. "Do you know what you've just done, Officer Kessler?" Kessler tried to steady his voice. I felt suspicious. He wouldn't show ID, and he matched the description." "And what was that description?" Monroe cut him off. Kessler stumbled. "Male, black, wearing a gray jacket." Monroe leaned back in her chair and shook her head. "You've just described nearly half the city's population." Elijah sat silently, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left deep marks. He hadn't spoken a word, and that silence made everyone in the room even more uneasy. Captain Monroe turned to him. "Agent Coleman, I apologize on behalf of this department. We will be filing an immediate report with Internal Affairs and the FBI. If you wish to submit a formal complaint—" Elijah raised his hand to stop her. He stood up, his eyes no longer angry, but deeply exhausted. "I'm not here to destroy someone's career," he said slowly, "but I also can't let this be swept away as a simple misunderstanding." He turned to Kessler, meeting his eyes. "Do you know what hurts the most? Not that you suspected me, but I've met hundreds of officers like you, people who believe they can sense a criminal just by how someone looks." Kessler flushed red, unable to respond. Elijah continued, his voice lowering. "I'm an agent, but I'm also a father, a husband, a black man who once walked to school past 3 police checkpoints. I live 2 lives, one respected because of my badge, the other constantly questioned because of my skin." The room grew so quiet that the ticking of a wall clock echoed like thunder, and then Elijah delivered his final words. "Reform doesn't start in the Capitol. It begins when a police officer learns to see the human being instead of the shadow of a stereotype." It wasn't an insult. It was the truth, spoken by a man who had been wronged by the system he served and still chose to speak out for change. Not just to expose, but to rebuild. After leaving the conference room, Elijah stepped into the hallway of the police station, the cold fluorescent lights casting a pale glow on his calm face. But in his eyes, Captain Monroe saw something familiar. The crack formed by enduring far too much, for far too long. Inside the conference room, Officer Kessler remained seated with Monroe. His confidence was gone, his authority stripped away. What was left was a man confronting himself, and the raw truth that he had abused his power for no reason other than prejudice. "Do you think I'm a racist?" Kessler asked quietly, like a child searching for forgiveness. Monroe didn't answer right away. She planted both hands on the table and looked him square in the eye. "No, you're a product of a system conditioned to fear what it doesn't understand." The silence lingered. Then Monroe continued, her voice soft but resonant. "You're not the first to get caught in that cycle, but you could be the first to step out of it." Kessler looked up, his eyes uncertain. "What should I do?" Monroe pulled a document from her desk drawer. It was a registration form for a pilot program on racial bias training and law enforcement behavior reform, recently issued by the Department of the Interior. "Take this course, not for me, not for him, for yourself and every person you'll ever encounter out there." Kessler stared at the form, then nodded slowly. But inside, for the first time in years, he felt small and began to learn the meaning of listening. Asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, Elijah stood outside the building calling his wife. "I'm okay," he said softly. "Everything's fine." On the other end, her gentle voice replied, "Was it that again?" Elijah hesitated for a beat, Yeah, but this time, someone might be listening. He hung up. But he hasn't walked away yet, because inside him, an old memory had resurfaced. The day he was handcuffed at 17, just for waiting outside a store while his mother shopped. He wasn't angry at Kessler. He was angry at the cycle this system had created, where black people must constantly prove their innocence, while those in uniform are automatically presumed right. But today, he felt something had shifted, not because of his title, but because of truth, because of the courage to respond, not with hatred, but with a lesson. In his small apartment, Officer Andrew Kessler sat quietly at his kitchen table that evening. A soft yellow light fell over an unopened file, the file of Elijah Moore, the man he had handcuffed in broad daylight for reading a book in the park. But this time, Kessler wasn't opening the file to find faults or build a case. He opened it to understand. Inside were detailed records. A senior FBI agent, former lead on the Federal Local Security Collaboration Program, and keynote speaker at multiple conferences on criminal justice reform. A man awarded a medal for leading a multi-state drug trafficking takedown operation, an operation Kessler had once heard about and admired. Kessler paused. Beneath the records was a photo of Elijah teaching a training course for young officers. The caption read, "Training Module, Building Trust Between Communities and Law Enforcement." Kessler found himself thinking, the man I treated like a common suspect is the very one trying to fix the system I belong to. That night, Kessler didn't sleep. His mind replayed fragments of memories he thought he'd buried. His father, a former officer, shouted slurs at black people during the evening news. That Christmas party years ago, where a colleague bragged about putting young black kids in their place, like it was a badge of honor. His first time holding a gun, when the instructor said, "If you see a black man running, don't ask why." Those broken shards slowly pieced together a picture he'd never dared to look at. He wasn't inherently cruel, but he'd been taught to fear, and that fear had led to the mistake he made today. Kessler stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city buzzed quietly under the glow of streetlights. Part of him still wanted to deny it, but another part, beginning to awaken, knew that silence is also a form of complicity. He turned back to the table, slid over a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. To the training team, I, Andrew Kessler, Level 3 Officer of the City Police Department, request enrollment in the Racial Awareness and Law Enforcement Reform Program. I don't want to be the next person who makes someone pay simply for the color of their skin. I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to learn how to be part of the solution. Kessler felt a slight weight lift from his chest as he signed his name. He knew this wouldn't erase what he'd done, but it was the first step, and for the first time, he truly wanted to step out of his own shadow. The next morning, Elijah Moore walked into the federal office. The solemn weight of the previous day no longer clung to him, but the weariness in his eyes had yet to fade. He had lived through this too often, being suspected, detained, and then apologized to. But this time felt different, deeper, heavier. Sitting at his desk, he noticed an envelope placed neatly in front of him. His name was handwritten in an unfamiliar script. Inside was a brief invitation. Agent Moore, our office cordially invites you to participate in an internal dialogue on reforming local officer training, an initiative jointly conducted by the FBI and the City Police Department. Session topic: From mistaken arrest to meaningful reform time, Friday, 2 p.m. Elijah squinted slightly. This wasn't a routine invitation. At the bottom were 3 signatures, including that of Captain Laura Bennett. He paused. That woman had handled everything differently. No denial, no cover-up, only calm professionalism, and a gaze that genuinely seemed to want change. Elijah held the letter and stepped out onto the balcony. The early sunlight brushed his shoulders like a quiet reminder. You can't walk away. Not this time. On the appointed day, when Elijah entered the auditorium, the main conference room inside the city police headquarters, he felt every eye turned toward him. Some were curious, some uneasy, but a few were genuinely grateful. And in a quiet corner of the room sat Andrew Kessler. No uniform, no hardened posture, just a man, learning how to listen. Captain Bennett opened the session with a clear and unwavering statement. Today we're not here to debate right or wrong. We're here to talk about how not to repeat what happened. And I believe the person who can help us do that is sitting here. She turned to Elijah. He stood up, slowly. No stage presence, no lecture, just a steady, grounded voice. I've worn the badge. I know the pressure you face. But I also wear this skin. The same skin that can get me handcuffed in the middle of a park. I live between two worlds. And I'm here today to try and bring them together. The room fell silent. Kessler looked at Elijah, and for the first time, didn't see a suspect or a name on a file. He saw a human being, resilient, generous, and still willing to offer a hand, even after being wronged. The dialogue lasted 2 hours, not to assign blame, but to unpack unconscious habits, to dismantle biases that had been taught as truth. As it ended, a young officer stood up, voice trembling. I don't know who was right or wrong in every detail, but I know this. I don't want to be the next person to put someone through that. Elijah nodded. He didn't need to win a debate. He just needed to plant a seed, late at night. Andrew Kessler sat alone in his small apartment near the old train station. A cup of cold coffee sat on the table, his phone lying motionless beside a half-finished stack of reports. He had just lived through a long day, not because of the workload, but because of that morning's dialogue with Elijah Moore. 18 years in uniform, he thought he'd grown immune to criticism. But today, Elijah's words didn't just pass through his ears. They cut deep, quietly, but undeniably. I've worn the badge. I know the pressure you face, but I also wear this skin. Kessler looked at the mirror on the wall. The reflection staring back wasn't the confident, composed police officer he had always seen, but a man struggling to face himself. He remembered his early days, his first year on the force. His training officer once said, "If you see a black man sitting quietly in a park without clear reason, check him. 9 times out of 10, your gut's right." Back then, Kessler had nodded, not out of malice, but because he believed it was just how things worked. And then, over time, lessons like that became instinct. There is no need for reasons, no questions asked, just a feeling, and action followed. But this time, with Elijah, he had handcuffed a completely innocent man. Not just innocent, a federal agent, a man who had sworn to uphold the law, just like him. Kessler exhaled deeply. From the depths of his conscience, he knew his greatest mistake wasn't being wrong. He was never even asking himself if he could be wrong. He opened his laptop and began to type. Email subject: regarding this morning's dialogue and about myself. In the letter to Captain Bennett, he admitted, I was wrong not just in my actions, but in the belief system I've carried for nearly 2 decades. I'm no longer sure I'm someone to be looked up to, but I believe I can be an example of something else, that if someone like me can change, then others can too. At the end of the email, he wrote, I volunteer to take part in any reform program, retraining session, and, if needed, I'll share my story so younger officers won't walk the same path I did. When he hit send, Kessler didn't feel relief, but there was one thing he did feel. Clearly, for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to protect himself. He was choosing to face the truth. Soft sunlight streamed through Captain Laura Bennett's office window early the next morning. On her desk, the laptop pinged, a new email. from someone she least expected. Officer Andrew Kessler. She read it slowly, line by line. As a seasoned commander, Bennett had handled hundreds of misconduct reports, complaints, and internal reviews. But this letter was different. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a glossed-over explanation. It was a direct, humble confession. No evasion, no defensiveness. I take responsibility and am ready to change. Captain Bennett sat still for a moment. Inside her, emotions clashed, anger as a leader betrayed by one of her own, disappointment in the system, and a flicker of hope. She remembered the day she was first appointed district captain, a black woman among a force mainly made up of white men. The skeptical eyes seemed to wait for her to stumble. "Are you sure you're tough enough to lead them?" one commander had asked. Now, she sat not to judge, but to make a pivotal decision. Would she treat Kessler as an example, to be punished, or as a chance to drive real change? For a brief moment, she thought of Elijah, his calm, deep gaze as he said, "Forgiveness doesn't erase responsibility, but it can open a door for someone to step out of their own shadow." Tapping her fingers on the desk, Captain Bennett signaled to summon Detective Vasquez, the officer in charge of behavioral and psychological reform training for recruits. "Prepare the advanced retraining file, and let me know when there's a scheduled slot to bring Officer Kessler in as a support trainer." Vasquez looked surprised. "Captain, Kessler, but we're still reviewing his conduct." Bennett nodded. "I'm not forgiving. I'm allowing change. If we're unwilling to give those who've failed a chance to repair, then reform is an empty slogan." She turned back to her desk and reopened Kessler's email. Then she began to type her reply. "Officer Kessler, I've received your message. I do not erase the consequences of your actions, but I acknowledge this. The courage to confront oneself is the first step in any meaningful change. Now prove to me, and this community, that your apology is real. Opportunity will come with responsibility, and I will personally watch your every step." Captain L. Bennett. When she hit send, Bennett didn't feel relieved, but she knew. For the system to change, courage must begin with those who have the power to offer a second chance. That afternoon, Elijah Brooks stepped out of Captain Bennett's office, holding a folder filled with documents on upcoming reform initiatives within the police department. He strolled down the hallway as a few officers silently glanced at him. There were no hostile or overly friendly looks, just a quiet, contemplative stillness. Elijah had long grown used to suspicious stares, reserved for people accused without guilt, aimed at anyone who walked into a police precinct and was automatically assumed to be a problem. But this time, things felt different. A few rooms down the hall, Andrew Kessler was attending his first retraining session. No uniform, no gun at his side. Kessler looked smaller, not in stature, but under the invisible weight of self-awareness. "When I approached a black man, my mind automatically triggered a heightened alert," he said to a group of young officers attending a mandatory racial bias training. "I thought I was just being cautious, but really, I was projecting prejudice, with no justification." His voice was low and halting. There was no applause, but no one turned away either. One young officer raised a hand. "Why admit that? Aren't you afraid of losing your reputation?" Kessler gave a faint, bitter smile. "True honor doesn't come from hiding mistakes. It comes from making sure they never happen again." At that exact moment, Elijah stood silently behind a glass window, watching. He hadn't come to judge. He hadn't come to witness failure. He just wanted to know, can people truly change? A part of him had once believed, no one changes. They only apologize when they're caught. But then he looked into Kessler's eyes, no longer proud, but honest and exposed, and Elijah felt something shift. There are lessons no training manual will ever teach. They only come when a person faces the truth about themselves and chooses not to look away. That evening, Elijah was invited to speak at a community forum inside the police department's main auditorium. He stepped onto the stage facing the city's residents, the officers in the room, and even some who had once doubted him. He spoke slowly and firmly. "I didn't come here to demand submission. I didn't come for revenge. I came to prove this. A black man in plain clothes, sitting in a park, should not be handcuffed because of a gut feeling. And a police officer can learn to rise above bias if they're brave enough to confront themselves. We are rewriting how justice works. And this time, no one gets left behind because of the color of their skin." At the back of the room, Captain Bennett nodded slowly. She knew. Tonight wouldn't erase every injustice, but at the very least, it had laid the first brick on a foundation she believed was worth building. A month after the incident at the police department, autumn had begun to paint the streets around Riverside Park in golden hues, a place where what seemed like a small event had shaken an entire system. There, Elijah Brooks once again sat on the familiar wooden bench. The book in his hands was no longer a means to escape reality, but a way to reflect on how to change it. Not far from him, a group of black teenagers played basketball, laughing loudly. No one saw them as a threat. No one called the police, because there were too many of them. At the city police headquarters, a new notice board stood in the main lobby. Reform program, implicit bias training, behavioral oversight, and community dialogue. Advisory lead, Elijah Brooks. Captain Laura Bennett stood before the media at a press conference later that week. She didn't dance around the issue. What happened was a wake-up call, but we're not stopping there. We're rebuilding from the inside, not just to prevent mistakes, but to foster a culture of genuine respect. Standing beside her was Andrew Kessler. Though no longer active in the force, he had volunteered as a speaker for the department's reform initiative. A man who once failed is now a living example that change isn't just possible, it's necessary. At the city's community center, a town hall titled Rebuilding Trust drew a large crowd that evening. Citizens, officers, students, and even former victims of racial profiling gathered in one room. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he stepped to the podium and scanned the room. "I used to think justice was just the law, but after everything, I've come to understand. True justice begins when we're willing to confront the darkness within ourselves and not look away." He paused, then continued. "I wasn't angry at the mistake when handcuffed because of my skin color. I was angry because it wasn't uncommon. But I'm not here today to speak about anger. I'm here because I see hope in the eyes of those willing to listen, in the officers brave enough to start over, and in the apologies spoken not out of pressure, but out of genuine remorse." The room fell silent. Then the sound of applause rose, not for Elijah, but for what everyone understood deep down. A new chapter had begun. The following month, the city passed a new policy. All officers must undergo regular assessments on implicit bias, and any incident suspected to involve racial discrimination must be reviewed by an independent board, including community representatives and individuals like Elijah. No one saw it as blame or a knee-jerk reaction anymore. This was a legacy, not because Elijah was an FBI agent, but because he was a human being. And for the first time, the system had no choice but to recognize that. Ultimately, Elijah returned to the park with his young son. The boy looked up and asked, "Dad, someone at school told me you got arrested once. Were you scared?" Elijah smiled, gently brushing his son's hair. "I was, but I didn't let that fear define who I am. What matters most, son, is that if someone mistreats you, you are not wrong, and you have the right to stand up with others, so it doesn't happen again." The boy nodded, then kicked a soccer ball with his friends. Elijah sat back, watching the sky fade into a soft amber. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to run from, and for him, justice, real justice, had finally begun.